It would help if I turned up my sound. I thought I had everything mixed up. There we go. There we go. There we go. Now we're all set. Now the sound's on. Let's start all over again. Welcome to the show, everybody. My name is Brian Schott, and this is What the Heck is Happening in Utah Politics. I'm an independent journalist who's been covering Utah politics for more than 25 years. I am the publisher and managing editor of UtahPoliticalWatch.news, an independent news website. And I'm here tonight to talk about what's happening in Utah politics, answer your questions. You're going to help me drive the show. I want to know what you're interested in. I want to get your thoughts. I want to try to answer your questions about things. And we'll just go from there. But a lot of it is going to be about redistricting. And so put your questions in the chat. We are live tonight on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. So put your comments again in the chat, and I will, hopefully, I'll be able to answer those questions for you. Maybe some Utah lawmakers will tune in as they have in the past. Okay, so here we go. Let's talk about redistricting. As everybody knows, on Monday, the Utah legislature approved their map, Option C. They had to redraw a map because a judge tossed the old one because she ruled that the legislature violated the Utah Constitution when they repealed Proposition 4. That's the ballot initiative that was passed by voters in 2018 that established an independent redistricting commission. And what it did was it took redistricting away from the legislature. There was a 7-person commission, and it had guidelines on how they were supposed to draw the maps. And among those things, they couldn't use any partisan data. We heard a lot about that during this last process. No partisan data. They had to try to keep counties together, keep cities together, keep communities of interest together. They couldn't look at that partisan data. They could not draw a map. They could not draw a district that would favor or unfavor an incumbent or a party. And in 2020, the legislature passed SB 200, which repealed Prop 4, kept an independent commission in place, but they didn't have the last word on redistricting. They were only an advisory commission. And lawmakers got to draw their own maps. Prop 4 was also designed to outlaw partisan gerrymandering in the state, and that got repealed as part of SB 200. Lawmakers drew these extremely gerrymandered maps in 2021. Shortly after that, a coalition of groups, including Mormon Women for Ethical Government, the League of Women Voters of Utah, and a number of individuals, sued, claiming the maps were a gerrymander and that the legislature acted improperly when they repealed a voter initiative. It's taken a long time for us to get to this point. Last summer, the Utah Supreme Court ruled that the legislature did overstep their constitutional authority when they repealed Prop 4, sending it back down to a lower court. The lower court then said you have to prove that the changes you made to Prop 4 were limited and met a compelling government interest. That's not what happened. The legislature, she didn't buy their arguments, and so she threw out the congressional maps that had been enacted in 2021. You'll probably hear my dogs losing their mind outside, and I apologize for that. But she ruled that in August, threw out the maps. Everybody had to go back to the drawing board. The legislature redrew the maps. They presented 5 options. They had to follow the rules of Prop 4, no partisan data. And the one that they settled on was Option C, which is the one that just happened to maximize the Republican advantage out of all of the maps. Gwen Higgins on TikTok says, 2018 is so long ago. Yeah, it was. We've been fighting this battle. They've been fighting this battle for that long to get to this point. Welcome into the show, Gwen. Glad to have you here. So, and then on Monday, the legislature approved Map C. Let me bring that up here so everyone can get a look at that. Audio on Instagram. That's not what I wanted to do there. Oh, I know what this is. Fixing thing here so I can get the microphone. Now you should be able to hear me on Instagram and TikTok. Had one thing clicked incorrectly. So, as you're looking at Prop 2, or at Option C, this is Option C that was passed by the legislature, it maximizes the Republican advantage of all the map proposals. It creates 4 districts where Donald Trump would have been the winner looking at the 2024 presidential election results. But 2 of them, District 2 and District 3 under this map, those districts could be considered swing districts. Donald Trump won those 2 districts in 2024. He carried them by 6.5 points or less. Actually, District 3, he carried it by 2.28%. Those are very close elections. Very different from what we had in the previous map, which, trying to read some of those chat things and work out these audio issues. Very different from what we had in some of the previous maps, in the 2021 maps, where Republicans won all of those districts by 19 points or more. They were extremely Republican districts, and they did that by carving up Salt Lake County, specifically Mill Creek. Mill Creek got cut into 4 pieces. That's where the nexus was of these 4 districts. Pretty much a gerrymander. Big time gerrymander. Okay, I think everybody should be able to hear me now. Maria on YouTube says, with the constitutional duty of the legislature to draw maps, how the judge would not approve Map C. Well, as we talked about in previous live streams, they also passed a law at the last second that created a very complicated mathematical equation that what it did was made it so pretty much any map that they gave that was gerrymandering or that was gerrymandered would be considered fair. they set the rules for what was considered fair. That was a bill that came from Senator Brady Brammer, and we can get to that in a second. But let's go back and continue talking about Option C. So if you look at this Option C map, it's much more competitive than what we had in the past. This map, Districts 2 and Districts 3, District 2 and 3, much closer for Donald Trump in the presidential election in 2024. I don't have them up on this graphic, but in 2020, his margin in CD3 was even much closer. It was like half a point over Joe Biden. So this is the map the legislature put forward. Now, the plaintiffs also had a couple of maps, and I'm going to try to get to those in a second. Hang on. Come over here. Yeah, we'll bring up the plaintiffs' maps now. These are the maps that were put forward by the plaintiffs. There were two of them. This is the first one. It's a little bit big on the... let me make this a little bit smaller here for you. There you go. You should be able to see it a little bit better now. Make that a little bit bigger. So this is the first map that was presented by the plaintiffs, Map 1, and it's a donut hole concept. Hope you can see my mouse moving around here. District 1, this is centered on Salt Lake County. It's almost all of Salt Lake County. This little section of red right below that, that's where they have to split Salt Lake County. They cannot keep Salt Lake County together. They can't do that because there's just too much population there. All the districts have to have an equal population, around 817,000 people. So they had to cleave this off. But District 1, overwhelmingly Democrat. You can't argue against that. Kamala Harris would have won that in 2024 by 23 points. Donald Trump would have won the other three districts. District 2 by 28.1%, District 3 by 40.5%, District 4 by 31.66%. So, really big districts. The other map that the plaintiffs gave looks a lot like Option C. In fact, it's almost a carbon copy of Option C. There's one difference. We talked about this on a previous live stream, and I will I'll show you what I mean in just a second. But here on District 2, if you look at District 2, it connects part of Salt Lake County with Tooele County out west, and Kamala Harris would have carried that by 13.5 points. Donald Trump would have carried the other ones. CD1 by 28 points, CD3 by 19 points, CD4 by about 47 points. But the big difference between Option C, which is right there, is right here, okay? On the plaintiff's map 2, they kept Salt Lake City, the urban part of Salt Lake City, with West Valley City and South Salt Lake and Mill Creek in those areas. And I've got a close-up that I can show you that I pulled from Dave's redistricting. This is the big difference right here. On legislature Option C, Salt Lake City, and you can see the boundaries of that, are in the green district. That's the district that went for Donald Trump by 2.5 points or so in 2024. In the plaintiff's map, Salt Lake City is in the purple district and is kept with West Valley City and South Salt Lake and most of Mill Creek, Murray, Taylorsville, Kearns. They keep that together, and that creates a district that goes for Kamala Harris by 13.5 points. So that's a big swing right there. It's a very big swing. About 16 points there. And that is the second map that the plaintiffs submitted to the judge. Now, right now, they're fighting over a number of legal... they're fighting over this new law that they just passed on Monday. And we'll get into that. I can explain that for you if you'd like me to. They're fighting over that. The deadline for them to give all of their filings in support of their map in opposition to the other maps, 17th of October. And then after that, they have a hearing scheduled for, I believe, the 23rd and 24th of October. Now remember, all this has to be finished by November 10th. That is the date that the lieutenant governor said she needs to have a new map. Utah Elections Office needs to have a new map by November 10th in order to get all their systems in place, because they have to print ballots or finalize the ballot contracts. They have to get all their systems in place. And people who are going to run need to be able to decide whether or not they are going to run. Trayson Meekum on Instagram says, this is a good map. I believe she's talking about map option 2, or the plaintiff's map 2. She says the legislature doesn't realize the map they passed is a dummy mander. That was an article in the New York Times today where there was an argument made that it was a dummy mander, meaning that the Republicans outsmarted themselves. Now remember, they didn't use any partisan data. They weren't allowed to. The judge said you can't use any partisan data when you are drawing these maps. And they wagged their finger at us and scolded us. Anybody who even possibly suggested that they were using partisan data for these maps, and I'm sure that they didn't. But it just so happens that the map that they came up with has 4 Republican districts, which, as you can see from that last map, is really hard to do. That's a difficult thing to do. Jacob Daly on TikTok says, isn't the plaintiff's maps gerrymandered also? No, because it was not drawn specifically to... Well, you know what? I take that back. You could argue that it's a gerrymander, but what it does is the principles of Prop 4 said you had to try to keep cities together, counties together, communities of interest together, and they're keeping Salt Lake City proper together with the urban core, while the legislature's map slices that off and puts it with another part of the state, and connects it with a district that goes all the way down the eastern side of the state, all the way down to the southeast. And that, there's enough Republican vote there, as you saw in the 2024 election results, there's enough Republican vote to offset that big vote from Salt Lake City, the big vote that would obviously come in for Democrats. Someone says, on TikTok, Laughing is Best says, won't the GOP mailer that specifies Democrat disadvantage be used in court? No, it won't. I can see why you're saying that. What he's referring to is there was a coordinated effort by the Democratic Party and groups affiliated with the Democratic Party, including the Utah Eagle Forum, to try to get people to support map option C. That came after the map was proposed, and you're going to have a really hard time proving that they used any data, any partisan data. These maps were drawn by a gentleman by the name of Sean Trende. If you read Real Clear Politics, you'll know that he's one of their election analysts. I think he's their chief election analyst. He's sort of the go-to guy when it comes to redistricting for the GOP. And he produced these maps using whatever data he put into the formula, and it spit out these maps. The other 4 maps he had actually spit out one district that would favor the Democrats. So he had 5 maps, spit out those 5 maps. 4 had one district that would have favored the Democratic presidential candidate in both the 2024 and 2020 elections. Option C was the only one that would have favored the Republican. The 4-0 Republican sweep. So yeah, there's people. They won't be able to use that in court because I think that there's enough of a separation between the legislature and the people drawing the maps. And there's a difference, lawmakers, even though they are Republicans, they're not acting on behalf of the GOP, so there's some plausible deniability there. Jessica Marie says on TikTok, yeah, but they weren't supposed to, but there was an email of some sort. I can't prove that. I can't prove that. I mean, if you want to speculate, I'm sure that you can, but I can't prove that. That's not something that, I'm not going to go there. Looking around to see if there's any other comments to get to. Scrolling back just a little bit on TikTok, not seeing anything. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about fairness. I'm just going to recap really quickly. On Monday, along with this map, the legislature passed a brand new law. They made a change to Prop 4, which was the law when the judge overruled when the judge threw out the map. They also threw out SB 200, which was the law that repealed Prop 4. So what lawmakers did on Monday is they made a change to Prop 4. Prop 4 says that you're supposed to use standards, and they used the term partisan symmetry to determine whether these maps comply, whether they are fair. Lawmakers jumped into that fray and created 3 tests, and I don't have them in front of me right now, but there are 3 tests that created a mathematical formula to look at whether or not these maps were fair. And it created a standard. But what they did was, at the heart of all of these tests, they had something called the partisan index. And this is really, you can call it clever or you can call it insidious, whichever side of the aisle you're on. Okay. What they did was, this way that you calculate this partisan index is you average the results of the last 3 statewide elections. They have 5 elections that you take to average, and you take the last 3. So U.S. President, Governor, Attorney General, State Auditor, State Treasurer. You average the results for both the Republicans and the Democrats from those 3 elections, and then the difference between the 2 is the partisan index, okay? You take the larger number and you subtract 50 from it, and then you take the smaller number and then you add whatever you need to get to 50, and then that's the gap. And when you average those last 3 elections, because we will be using 2024 because of this new calculation, it would be U.S. President, Governor, and Attorney General. And I quickly did some math on this, and it came out that the average for the Republicans in that was around 57%, around there. And the Democrats, it was around 38, I think, 37 or 38%. That was the average between the 2. So that gap, which was 7 towards the Republican, almost 8 points towards the Republicans, 12 points to the Democrats, that's a 20-point gap. And anything that's within that gap, according to these other calculations, would be considered fair. What it does is it's trying to make the districts mirror statewide results for the state, which is Republican, which typically votes Republican. But they did something else, because if you remember in 2024, and I bring this up all the time because I think you need to understand what they did, what they added to this. Not only did they add those, but do you remember in 2024, it was just a year ago, Phil Lyman ran as a Republican for governor. He challenged Spencer Cox. He lost in the primary, then launched a write-in campaign. They have a provision in the bill that the 13.5% that Phil Lyman got in the general election as a write-in candidate, that would be factored into their statewide average for those 3 elections. Because he pursued the party's nomination, and so they're just going to count his votes as Republican votes. So instead of their average being 57 point whatever, it goes up to over 61%, because you're adding in that 13.5% to their average. They're just assuming that the people who would have voted for Phil Lyman would have all voted for Spencer Cox in the election. And so that is now the law. They made that change to Prop 4. And the way they did it was they just rammed it through, introducing most of the language in the bill. A lot of the language in the bill was introduced on the floor of the Senate when Senator Brammer introduced the bill. When he brought it up, that was the first time they were really seeing it. They didn't have much time to debate it. Nobody had any time to chew it over. The Republicans already knew that they were going to pass it. They passed it through. They had a provision in the bill that said if it got 2/3 in the House and the Senate, then it would become law. The moment that Governor Cox signed it, he signed it shortly after it hit his desk. It became law, and then they passed their map. It was a way to put their thumb on the scale, basically saying you have to putting the thumb on the scale so that the judge would have to accept the map that they give in, and not either of the plaintiffs' maps. The plaintiffs have already added to their lawsuit. They're trying to block this. There's a big fight happening over that as well. That could be a big delay tactic. That could be something that derails this whole thing and puts the 2021 maps back in place. All of that is still on the table. And they have to have this wrapped up by November 10th. A month from tomorrow. A month from Friday, they have to have this whole thing wrapped up. Let's see. Matt Throckmorton. Oh! Former Representative Matt Throckmorton. I think he's living out of state now. I don't think he lives in Utah anymore. But he says a different take on the presumed product. It seems the Democrats want a district that is basically Salt Lake County. It's both partisan as well as makes somewhat sense, though redistricting back in 2001, and I drew a congressional map and voices were split on the question. Some wanted cities left undivided, others wanted them divided. The rationale was, as an example, the map drew splits Utah County. Prior to it was all in the third. My logic was it gave Utah County 2 members of Congress, doubling their representation. A majority agreed with that map, but Jim Hansen, that's a fun story. I think Salt Lake County should have 2 or 3 federal representatives. And former Representative Matt Throckmorton, who's on the stream, glad to have you. He's back in Utah. I see your point, but you can't do that under Prop 4. You cannot split Salt Lake City 3. You have to try to keep it together. You have to try to keep, or you can't split Salt Lake County or minimize the splits. It's going to be split once because of the population. The population is too large. It just depends on where you split it. And as I showed you earlier, let me bring this up again. This is the difference between legislature option C and the plaintiff's map. Under option C from the legislature, they split it along sort of the East Bench, keeping Salt Lake City intact, keeping Salt Lake City, or splitting off Salt Lake City along the East Bench, Holiday, Cottonwood Heights, they all stay together, and connecting it out east to the eastern and southeastern part of the state. The plaintiffs keep the urban core together, and what they do is they keep Salt Lake City with West Valley City, Magna, South Salt Lake, that urban core together. So it's going to be split. Salt Lake County is going to be split. It just depends on where you split it. So it has to be split. But that's an interesting point. Jade on TikTok says, "Did the judge rule in favor for the legislature? I haven't heard." No, they have. They have not considered the maps yet. As I said earlier, they have until the 17th to make their filings, and then we'll have hearings on the 22nd and the 23rd, I believe, or the 23rd and 24th. It's one of those 2 dates. I'll have to look that up for you. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. I mean, spent a lot of time going back over that stuff. But one of the things I really want to talk about is if you look at where the incumbents are, under the legislature's map, it jams 3 current incumbents into the same district. They would all be in District 3. District 3? Yeah. They would all be in District 3. Blake Moore, Burgess Owens, Mike Kennedy. They would all be in the 3rd Congressional District. I'm going to actually show that to you right now. I used some data from a firm called L2. I made this little map. And Blake Moore, Burgess Owens, Mike Kennedy, they would all live in the 3rd Congressional District. Celeste Malloy would be in the 4th. None of them would live in the 2nd. None of them would live in the 1st. Now, they don't have to live in their district. There's no law, there's nothing in the Constitution that says a member of Congress has to live in the district that they represent. In fact, Burgess Owens does not live in his district. He cannot vote for himself. He lives in the 3rd district as it is right now. He is a constituent of Representative Kennedy, even though he's a member of Congress himself, but he can't vote for himself. He lives about 2 miles inside the border of District 3. On this map, he would also be, again, about 2 miles inside the border there. Kennedy would be a few miles away from the border of District 4. Moore would be about 10 miles away from, I believe, the closest border of District 2. None of them are close to District 1. None of them. Or closer than 10 miles. But they don't, so none of them would live in that district under those maps. They don't have to. And that's sort of become a thing in Utah. If you remember, and former Representative Throckmorton on Instagram will remember this, when Jason Chaffetz was first elected, he did not live in his district. He lived right outside the boundaries. He was in Alpine. He lived right outside the boundaries of his district. And they did some research, and he was, I think, the 3rd member of Congress. Research at the time, there was an article I read from the Deseret News back then. They did some research, talked with archivists in Congress, and he was only the 3rd member of Congress ever to live outside of the district where he represents. Now that's become commonplace. I think there's like 20 members of Congress right now who don't live in the district that they represent. Burgess Owens doesn't live in his district. When he was first elected, Blake Moore didn't live in his district. Blake Moore lived in, he didn't live in the 1st district. And then when they redrew the maps in 2021, his house was brought inside the 1st district. Same thing they did for Chaffetz. The Democrats actually tried this too. They had a candidate, I believe, who was going to run against Jason Chaffetz a number of years ago. It was Bo Babka, former Salt Lake County sheriff. He ran for Congress as a Democrat, and he did not live within the boundaries of his district. But Chaffetz, made it okay. But Chaffetz, none of them would live there. But actually, there's no perfect representation in any of the maps. Well, actually, in Plaintiff's Map 1, that's the closest we would get to perfect representation, or having one representative living within their district. Blake Moore would still live in Representative 1. Burgess Owens would live in District 4. Mike Kennedy and Celeste Malloy would both reside in District 3. But right here, right along the urban core, that's where most of Utah's representation is. Which is why I've never really bought the whole, we need to have urban-rural mix on districts. Because you're getting people who live along the urban core. Celeste Malloy is the first representative, I believe, in Utah history to come from the southern part of the state. Under Map 2, Burgess Owens and Mike Kennedy would share a district. Blake Moore would live in the 2nd, Celeste Malloy in the 4th. None of them would live in their districts. Oh, Nathan Detroit checks in on YouTube. He says, hello. Nathan is part of our Discord, the Utah Political Watch.news Discord, if you're become a paying subscriber to the website. you can get access to our Discord. And, sometimes there's not a lot to talk about, but during the redistricting process, it was really, really chatty. A lot of fun. Nathan's one of the guys who posts in there. So you can get to go, you can get to know Nathan. That's a perk for everyone. Scott Troxel says on TikTok, that's insane. They should have to live in their district. The only requirement is in the Constitution is that a member of Congress must be a resident of the state that they seek to represent when they are elected. Same thing with a member of the U.S. Senate. They don't have to be a resident until one day before they're elected. And if they establish that residency one day before they're elected, they can represent the state. That's the only residency requirements. For other offices here in Utah, I think you have to live in your district for 6 months. You have to be a resident of a district for 6 months. And that's bit a number of potential candidates in the past who have moved hoping to challenge someone, and then they didn't establish the residency requirements. A number of years ago, the Democrats had a gubernatorial candidate, or someone who was going to run for governor. I remember this because I covered it. They're getting ready to have a big press conference up at the elections office because this person, the name is escaping me, was a businessman, fairly wealthy. He was going to be their candidate for governor that year. I think it was prior to 2004. It was probably the 2000 race, maybe. And they were loaded for bear. They show up at the elections office. And then all of a sudden, as he's getting ready to file for office, everybody gets pulled into a back room. And the reporters were all standing there wondering what the heck's going on. And we wait and we wait and wait. And they came out and they said he hadn't lived in the state long enough. He didn't establish residency. Kind of the thing you might want to check out before you call the press down to hold a press conference. But I remember that well. That was such a weird press conference because the Democrats were fired up. They finally had a candidate who they thought was going to be able to wrest the governorship away from the Republican Party. And it turns out the guy didn't live here long enough. I think that might have been the year that they ended up nominating Bill Owens. I'll have to go back and look at that. Can't remember it off the top of my head. But it happened, and it was really funny. From TikTok, maybe a dumb question, but why is it that the rural areas and the urban areas have separate districts? Well, they don't under the current map, or the map that just got thrown out. That one was designed so that you would combine urban areas with rural areas. And you kind of have to do that in a lot of the maps because Utah's just so big, and there's all the people live in the urban areas. That's where the majority of the population is. The biggest population centers along the Wasatch Front. And then when you get out to the hinterlands, there's not a lot of people there. So you're going to have to combine that somehow. But sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But lawmakers did that. That was a rationale. And that's a rationale they've been using since 2001, as I've explained in the past. In 2001, we had a Democrat in Congress, Jim Matheson. He had been elected in 1998. And so he gets elected in 1998. He gets reelected in 2000. The 2001 redistricting comes along, and Republicans are determined to get rid of him. We only had 3 congressional districts at the time. And so they took his district, they took where he lived, and combined it with the eastern side of the state. It was a massive district. It was huge. And they gerrymandered that to try to get rid of him. And it didn't work. He hung on. He won as an incumbent, and he worked his tail off too. But it's very hard to beat an incumbent. And then when 2011 came around, they were going to try to get rid of him again. We got our 4th district at that time. And so they gerrymandered the 2nd district, which he represented. They gerrymandered that all to hell in an attempt to knock Matheson out. But he decided that he was going to run in the newly created 4th District. There's another member of Congress who didn't live in the district he represented. But he decided, so he jumped into the race in the 4th District rather than the 2nd District. And then he ended up beating Mia Love and then retiring from Congress 2 years later. But when the Republicans did that, when they tried to gerrymander him out of his seat in the 2nd District, they accidentally created a very competitive district in the 4th. The 4th District, between the years 2012, 14, 16, 18, and 20 election, that thing changed hands 4 times, elected 2 Democrats. You had Matheson, he was the first Democrat. Then Mia Love wins. She wins re-election in 2016. Ben McAdams knocks her off in 2018, a Democrat. He barely loses to Burgess Owens in 2020. They accidentally created that very competitive district. And the 2021 map was their efforts to not repeat that same mistake. Nana Beans on Instagram says, thoughts on Burgess Owens? I have read he only moved to Utah to run for office and still doesn't own a home here. Would love to know the facts. I can't say anything definitively, but there is, and I've pointed this to people before, there is a tremendous article in Mother Jones by a journalist that I really respect. Her name is Stephanie Mensimer. And she really dug into that. And he was living, and I think he still does live at a home that was owned by one of his big campaign donors in Draper. He moved here, I think, 2 years before he ran, or at least that's a voter record that I've seen. But yeah, he does not have a lot of deep roots in Utah. But I would look up that article from Mother Jones. Just Google search Mother Jones and Burgess Owens. It'll pop right up. It's a great article by Stephanie. She's got another article, brand new one. And I'm going to try to get her on the podcast. Maybe I'll bring her on to the live stream and talk about it. But she decided to look at the efforts of Doge. You know, Elon Musk's government cost-cutting stuff. It's a brand new article she just put out in the last week or so. And she went to Ogden and did some really deep reporting about the economic impact that those federal cuts are having on Ogden. And it's not good. It's really, really hitting the economy of Ogden hard. I would recommend that you read that article. It's really great. I need to have her on the pod, talk about that. Okay, so you don't have to live. I'm gonna take a drink for you real quick. So I wanted to talk a little bit more. I looked at, I'm going to bring up option C here again, because I got a few other stats about option C that I think are a little bit salient. I need to bring that article up here really fast. I decided to dig into voter registration numbers, just how much of a change, if we do get option C, if the legislature's efforts to get us to get the judge to pick option C, if those work, if that's indeed what happens when we get through this whole process a month from tomorrow. And you're looking at option C right here. Under the old map, and if you look at just straight up voter registration numbers, and I have access to a database. I was given some voter registration data by a political data firm called L2, and they've got some fantastic information. And the data available to me, if you look at the voter registration across the 4 districts, under the old map, Republicans are a majority. They make up at least 50% of all active voters in each of the 4 districts. I think one of them, they're like at 50.5%, but they are above 50% in each of the 4 seats. Mjolnir0531 on TikTok says, can the judge turn down all the options and make everyone go through the whole process again? No. These three maps, the three maps I've been talking about tonight, one of those three is the one that the judge is going to pick. And that's why legislators made that last-minute change to Prop 4 to make sure it was in place to kind of tie her hands and force her to pick option C. But back to this. So when you look at the voter registration numbers under the old map, Republicans made up at least 50% of all the registered voters in every single one of the 4 congressional districts. Kind of funny how that works out. And Democrats were... trying to find those exact numbers in my notes here. Democrats were around 13%. Yeah, the most they had was 15.3% in one of the districts. Everything below that, every other district, they were at 15% or below in terms of voter registration. Not population, voters now, okay? So Republicans had a majority, at least half in every single district, built-in advantage. Democrats were at 15% or less. Now, Utah is a Republican state. And remember, Democrats only make up about 13% of the voters in the state anyway. But when you look at what option C does, just in terms of pure voter numbers, in District 2 and 3, which look to be more competitive, the gap is much smaller. In District 2, registered Republicans only make up 42.5% of the voters. Not 50%, 42.5%. And in District 3, they make up 47.2%. And the Democrats, instead of making up 15% or less, in District 2, they're at almost 18%. And in District 3, they're a little bit more than 18%. So the numbers of Democrats go up in those two districts, the number of Democrats come down below 50%. And it makes that gap much smaller. If you subtract the number, if you subtract the Republican percentage away from, or if you subtract the Democratic percentage from the Republican percentage, that gap under the old map that just got thrown out was at least 35% or higher. Anywhere from 35% to almost 40% in difference. Under this map, District 2, that gap is about 25%. In District 3, that gap is at 29%. So again, it's not a slam dunk for the Democrats. It's not a Democratic-leaning district, but it is more competitive. And you have to understand this. For a Democrat to win in this state, they're not going to be able to win a big office like Congress, and especially a statewide race, simply by appealing to Democratic voters. It does not work. The math does not work for them. And they know this. What you have to do is you have to get almost all of the Democrats to vote for you. Then you have to get probably a majority of unaffiliated voters who don't vote for either, who don't belong to either party to vote for you. And you have to pull in a sizable chunk of Republicans, maybe 20%. And when you're running in a district where the registered Republicans are not 50%, they're 42%, and the registered Democrats are not 15%, they're 18%, well, then that hill you have to climb to pull in that group of voters, to pull in that coalition, to create that coalition, gets easier. It's not a slam dunk. It's not going to happen, but it gets easier. Jade on TikTok says, okay, so the judge basically has to pick option C then. This is all very interesting. Not necessarily. Legislators tried to stack the deck so that the judge has to pick option C. That's why they passed a change. They made a change to Prop 4, the law that everybody's operating under. Prop 4 is the law that they repealed in 2020, sorry. They repealed that in 2020, and then the courts ruled that the legislature unconstitutionally repealed that law because it was a voter initiative. And so that put Prop 4 back in place. Lawmakers made a change to Prop 4 that they slammed through on Monday. We didn't see the final version of the bill until shortly before it was introduced on the floor of the Senate, probably a couple hours before, maybe the night before. Not a lot of time to digest what it did. It created these very complicated mathematical equations to determine what is fair and what is not fair. Essentially to make it so that the judge would have no choice but to look at option C, and then here are these parameters the judge would have to use to evaluate that map, and then say it meets these parameters that are in the law. This is the one I'm picking. Try to tie their hands. And during the floor debate, it sounded like Senator Brady Brammer said that, made statements that could be interpreted as a threat to impeach the judge if she did not pick option C, because they made this change to the law. So they're trying to tie their hands. At the same time, shortly after the legislature adjourned on Monday from their special session, the plaintiffs made another court filing challenging this brand new law. So now they're fighting that out in court, fighting out whether the judge is going to block this law from going into effect. And if they do, here comes another round of appeals. And that could gum this whole thing up. Because remember, we have to be finished by November 10th. If we're not finished by November 10th, then it's probable that we're going to be running under the old maps for another cycle. And that feels like the process. It feels like that's what the Republican majority in the legislature wants. They're trying to create these delays. They've been complaining about how the process has been very, very rushed here at the end. And they're right. They've had the law was thrown out. The judge made a ruling on August 26th, a little more than a month ago. And now they've had to redraw maps. They pushed through a change to the law at the last second. Cynically, you can say that it was to either stack the deck in their favor or to create another delay. But we've got to be done by November 10th. And if we're not, then who knows what happens. Actually, I'm probably going to write about that tomorrow because I've got some theories on that. Nathan Detroit on YouTube says, I believe the plaintiffs claim their submitted maps comply with Brammer's bill now law, even though they objected to it. Is that correct? Are they correct? They drew they drew map 2 to comply with Brammer's new law. We knew that it was kind of coming because he did introduce a version of this bill at the beginning of the redistricting process. The legislature had a number of meetings with the redistricting committee, and they talked about a version of his bill. It has changed radically since then, before it became law, but they did know it was coming. They had an idea, so they drew that map specifically to comply with Brammer's new law, with this new law that was just put in place on Monday. And that is the map that keeps Salt Lake City together with the rest of the urban core that I was talking about earlier. Jade says, wow, this is insane. I hate it here. Welcome to Utah politics. And look, I've said this before. I love doing this. I like doing this because I like explaining how things work. I've been covering the legislature for more than 25 years. This is my 4th redistricting cycle. I was here in 2001, 2011, 2021, and now this one. I've seen all this stuff before. And I'm a civics dork. I love this stuff. And it's my job to explain it to you. That's what I enjoy doing. So, if I'm helping you become a little more informed, if I'm helping you understand the process, then I've done my job. And then you can be a more engaged citizen, because we're just not engaged. People are not engaged with the process. Process is so obtuse and complicated, and it's intentionally so, to get your eyes to glaze over so you don't engage and you don't care what's going on. But, the old saying is, if you don't take an interest in politics, too bad. It's going to take an interest in you. All right, I've been talking for about an hour. We're coming up to the end. Is there anything else that anybody wants to Anybody else who wants to, has a question, a comment, anything you want to talk about before I wrap it up here for this evening? Jade on TikTok says, how do you take care of yourself and your own mental health with covering this kind of thing? I'm sick. I'm a very sick person. I love this. This beats a real job. If I had to, I think I'd go insane if I had to go into an office and do the same thing every day. I like digging into these things and trying to figure out how they work and then explaining them to people. This is what I've done. A lot of people don't know this, but I literally started my career in media when I was 13 years old in my hometown in Colorado, small farming community in Colorado. I got a job at the local radio station working nights. And I had to record newscasts for the radio station that maybe 200 people heard. And I kept that job throughout high school, kept doing that sort of thing throughout college. Mostly was in radio for most of my career until I moved out here. And then I saw where things were going, and I taught myself how to do a lot of the stuff online. But I'm a sick person. I love this. I love the news. I love the grind of it. And I've got a supportive wife who allows me to commit acts of journalism, which, is all that one can ask for. All right, I think last question, Mjolnir. Why are Utah politicos so obsessed with control over their constituents? The joke up on the hill is this. Lawmakers in Utah believe in local control until the locals need controlling. They love to talk about local control until the locals do something that they don't like, and then they swoop in and they control them. If you remember your civics lessons, they always talk about 3 branches of government, 3 co-equal branches of government. The legislature, for as long as I've been doing this, they have believed that they are superior among equals. They are the superior branch of government, not the executive, not the judiciary. And it's hard to argue that they're not, even though they are a part-time legislature. But they're extremely powerful. Legislative leaders are extremely powerful. Okay. Hope everybody has a great evening. That's going to wrap it up for me. As usual, my little pitch, if you've enjoyed what I've done, go to my website, utahpoliticalwatch.news. Sign up for my newsletter. It's free. If you want to help support what I do, help make this possible, you can become a paying subscriber or make a one-time donation there at the website. I'm an independent journalist. That means nobody owns my website. I own my website. I own my output. I am responsible for all of this. I don't have a billionaire who owns my website. I don't have a billionaire sugar daddy. They don't keep me afloat. I don't have a corporation. I'm not like CBS News where they bought Bari Weiss's Free Press for $150 million and then made her the head of CBS News. That's right-wing control of media. That's corporate control of media. That's not what I do. I'm allowed to write what I want. I'm allowed to poke eyes where I need to. I'm allowed to rub people the wrong way. That's what I do. But the problem is, I don't have much of a safety net. I rely on my readers. I rely on my viewers for support. So if you can, go to my website. Once again, utahpoliticalwatch.news. Sign up for my newsletter. If you can become a paying subscriber, do that. Maybe make a one-time donation if you don't want a subscription. Every little bit helps. Remember to drop me a follow on whatever app you're watching. Follow me on TikTok. Follow me on Instagram. Drop a like. Tell your friends about it. We're all in this together. And I just appreciate having the opportunity to talk with you about what's happening. We'll do a couple more of these next week. If you have anything that you want to talk about, any topics that are on your mind, all you have to do is drop me a DM on any of the social media apps or an email. You'll find my email at the website. Hope you have a great weekend. I'm going to go watch the season finale of Peacemaker. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll talk to you next week. Love y'all.